But going back to the point, so what we've got to remember is that the Dutch and the Dutch East India Company, which was based out of what is modern-day Indonesia, was the first to land on the Australian mainland, and that happened up in the Gulf of Carpentaria in 1606. And what you have then, the ship that did that was the Doifken, and from memory, maybe one or two mariners off the ship were speared by the Aborigines that were there and died. And then over the next 60 years or so, the Dutch charted the coast of Australia, just to clarify, they charted what they had named New Holland. And in the exploring New Holland, they realised, well, there's not much really that we can trade here. So there were, for the Dutch, their game was to make money, and you made money by getting some rare item and trading it elsewhere for tradable goods.
So a big part of their business, especially in what became Indonesia, was spices.
Correct. So
that's how they made most of their wealth.
Yeah.
And
so there were certain. So in the Indonesian archipelago, there are certain islands that have certain unique goods. So, for instance, cloves, which are used for preserving things. That's one. Pepper, that was another. So back in this era, you had islands like Ternate and one or two others. The names escape me, and that's closer towards Irian Jaya or West Irian, which is on the Papua New Guinea continent. Okay, and nations went to war over these goods because they were just so valuable. Some of these spices were more valuable than gold.
Yeah, big fight in the spice cabinet.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah. So,
but this is the first Europeans we're talking about. I think there's a lot of extensive trade between the indigenous tribes of the northern part of Australia,
correct,
and the Papua New Guineans and the Indonesians.
Yeah. So one of the it's come out in research in the last 30, 40 years that there were engagements between Australia's northern Aborigines on the coast, trading between them and native traders that were coming out of the Indonesian islands. And oftentimes that, again, was for sea cucumbers or beach de noix. And that's because it was a valuable item that could then be dried and shipped up to China. So, you've got these various parties contributing or playing in the game in order to make a living. And it was quite seasonal. But so the net effect is that 2/3 of the Australian landmass, then known as New Holland, had been mapped by the Dutch, but they hadn't found anything of significant value to trade, and so they basically left it.
So when they went back to Europe and they told everyone what they'd found, I mean, how did the British then decide, all right, well, maybe we should make a trip down there?
Okay, well, there are various narratives that one could point to. Great power rivalry. So if you look at it from the point of view of the British, had both the Indian and Pacific Oceans to themselves in terms of no other British subject could enter that region without the permission of the British East India Company. But most of their focus was on India and China trade, and they weren't that interested in exploiting the resources, the maritime resources. So really what you've got to say is that James Cook, initially a lieutenant in charge of the bark Endeavour, and then eventually a commander in charge of an expedition of 2 ships, opened up the Pacific from the point of view of the knowledge. He closed the gap. There'd been this concept of a Great South Land that was both in myth and collective wisdom. People believed there had to be something there. And he was... But again, you've got to look at it and go, well, hang on, he didn't do it all on his own. For instance, Abel Tasman had been there 130 years before, and Abel Tasman had touched on what is part of Tasmania. We named the island of Tasmania for Abel Tasman.
Oh, right.
Okay? Back then, Tasman had named it Van Diemen's Land for a member of the Dutch East India Company that he knew. And then
that's very nice of him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, that's often the way. It's a little bit too egocentric to name something for yourself.
Right.
But also New Zealand. So so New Zealand was named by the Dutch, by Tasman, and effectively the name is Nueva Zelanda. So he was naming it as a new part of the world that's similar to back home.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Cook didn't discover New Zealand. All Cook did was he circumnavigated New Zealand in order to ascertain the dimensions of that island group. And similarly, he didn't go down to Tasmania, or what was then Van Diemen's Land, but he entered at a point, having sailed from Tahiti, and then proceeded north. Now, Cook, and it reflects the British sense of divine destiny. The British saw themselves as being better mariners and more deserving of an empire than the Spanish or the Portuguese. So what you have is that Cook was aware of the earlier explorations by people such as Torres. So Torres had been the first man to chart a route below New Guinea. So we know Torres Strait, which is the quite constrained narrow waters between New Guinea in the north and the Australian mainland in the south.
Cape York Peninsula.
Correct. Yes.
Top end, essentially. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So what Torres did is he found a way. He was part of there were several ships in this expedition, but Torres was the one who basically found a way through. Okay, and the Spanish at the time were not big on promoting what they had discovered and their contribution to global knowledge, because they were trying to guard their empire and they didn't want interlopers. Whereas for the French and the British and the Dutch to a lesser extent, there was this sharing of information, because they were the smaller players and they were wanting to eat into the great imperial power, which was Spain. So what you have is when Cook sailed in 1768, okay, so a little bit of time before Cook went on his first voyage of discovery, there was a chap called Alexander Dalrymple. Alexander Dalrymple had originally wanted to be the guy that took the expedition to Tahiti, and then which James Cook had. So Dalrymple gave effectively a bit of a sketched chart of the discoveries by the Spanish at this time. And part of that was to point to Torres having sailed below Papua New Guinea. Now, Cook never acknowledged that he'd seen this, but it would be surprising for Joseph Banks to have a map and to not share it with Cook. You know, that would... You'd look at that and go, no, that wouldn't have happened. They would have been talking about it.
Yeah.
So James Cook knew that once he'd rounded what became Cape York, that he was home and hose, because he had indications from elsewhere that this was the way home. So once Cook had rounded the top of Cape York, he landed on an island, which is now called, he named Possession Island, and he claimed the whole of the east coast of the New Holland landmass for Britain, and he called it New South Wales. So New South Wales, back in the day, was effectively the whole of the east coast, and then a line inwards to which roughly cuts through Northern Territory and South Australia nowadays. So it was that's what the British were claiming as their own. Okay. And then for the western part, the western half, that was acknowledged as being a process of Spanish discovery.
Right.